a neighborly favor. Lila hurried through the bustling streets of her vibrant urban neighborhood, the aroma of her freshly baked chicken noodle soup wafting from the insulated container in her hands. The warm, savory scent mingled with the familiar sounds of the city, the honking horns, the chatter of passers-by, and the rhythmic clatter of the elevated train overhead. As Lila navigated the crowded sidewalks, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and connection to the diverse community that surrounded her. This was her home, a place where she had grown up, forging strong bonds with her neighbors and exploring the endless possibilities of city life. Today, however, Lila's steps were tinged with a hint of worry. Earlier that morning, her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Flores, had called to say she was feeling unwell. Lila had immediately sprung into action, whipping up a nourishing soup and packing it carefully to bring to her friend. Mrs. Flores has always been there for me, Lila thought, her brow furrowing with concern. Now it's my turn to be there for her. Lila and Mrs. Flores had developed a close relationship over the years. The kind-hearted older woman had been a constant source of wisdom and support, often inviting Lila over for tea and sharing stories of her own childhood in the city. In turn, Lila had become a trusted companion, helping Mrs. Flores with chores and errands when she needed an extra hand. As Lila approached Mrs. Flores' apartment building, she quickened her pace, eager to check on her friend. The familiar facade of the brick building came into view, and Lila felt a sense of relief wash over her. She hurried up the steps and pressed the buzzer, waiting anxiously for a response. After a few moments, Mrs. Flores' voice crackled through the intercom. "Lila, is that you, dear?" she asked, her tone weaker than usual. "Yes, Mrs. Flores, it's me," Lila replied, her heart sinking at the sound of her neighbor's frail voice. "I've brought you some homemade soup. Can I come up?" There was a brief pause before Mrs. Flores responded. "Oh, Lila, that's so thoughtful of you. Please come on up." Lila heard the click of the door unlocking, and she pushed it open, stepping into the familiar lobby. As she made her way up the stairs, she couldn't help but notice the silence that hung in the air, a stark contrast to the usual bustling energy of the building. When Lila reached Mrs. Flores' door, she knocked gently, her brow creased with worry. "Mrs. Flores? It's me, Lila. I'm coming in, okay?" Lila turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open, peering inside. The apartment was dimly lit, and Mrs. Flores was seated in her favorite armchair, a blanket draped over her lap. She looked up at Lila with a weak smile, her face pale and drawn. "Oh, Lila, thank you for coming," Mrs. Flores said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid I'm not feeling my best today." Lila hurried to her side, setting the soup container on the coffee table. "I can see that," she said, her tone gentle and concerned. "I'm so sorry to hear you're not feeling well. Is there anything I can do to help?" Mrs. Flores reached out and patted Lila's hand. "You're already doing so much, my dear. Just your presence is a comfort to me." Lila felt a lump in her throat as she looked at her elderly neighbor, her heart aching to see her in such a fragile state. Mrs. Flores had always been the picture of strength and resilience, and Lila couldn't bear the thought of her suffering. "Well, then, let's get you some of this soup," Lila said, forcing a smile. "I made it just the way you like it, with extra noodles and a sprinkle of Parmesan on top." Mrs. Flores' eyes lit up, and she nodded gratefully. "That sounds wonderful, dear. I'm sure it will hit the spot." Lila carefully ladled the steaming soup into a bowl and handed it to Mrs. Flores, watching as the older woman took a tentative sip. A look of contentment washed over her face, and Lila felt a sense of relief. As Mrs. Flores savored the soup, Lila settled into the chair beside her, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could help her friend. She knew that Mrs. Flores lived alone, and the idea of her struggling through this illness without support filled Lila with a deep sense of concern. Mrs. Flores, Lila began, her voice soft and honest, is there anything else I can do for you? Perhaps I could stay and keep you company, or call a doctor to come take a look. Mrs. Flores shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with gratitude. You've already done so much, Lila. I don't want to be a burden. Lila reached out and squeezed Mrs. Flores' hand, her expression resolute. You could never be a burden, Mrs. Flores. You're my friend, and I care about you. Please, let me help in any way I can. The older woman's eyes glistened with tears, and she nodded, a weak smile spreading across her face. Well, if you insist, my dear, I would appreciate the company. And perhaps you could help me with a few small tasks around the house, if it's not too much trouble. Lila's face lit up with a warm smile. Of course, Mrs. Flores. I'm happy to help in any way I can. You just rest, and I'll take care of everything. As Lila settled in beside her neighbor, she felt a sense of purpose and determination. Mrs. Flores had always been there for her, and now it was Lila's turn to return the favor. She would do whatever it took to ensure her friends' well-being and comfort, no matter the challenge.